have an agenda in front of you. Some of our speakers may not take up the full allotted time. Some may go a little over, as some have quite a bit of information to cover for us. What we're going to start with in our first hearing for the Select Committee is dealing with blight in the City of Jackson and state-owned tax forfeited property in the City of Jackson, and how we can address those issues legislatively from a state level. Our first speaker this morning is Bill Cheney. He's the Assistant Secretary of State Public Lands Division, and he is going to give us quite an overview of the process associated with tax forfeited property, as well as showing us lots of maps that they have prepared for us concerning locations of these various properties. And I think that this initial speaker will give us all a great overview of where we're going to go throughout this entire hearing. Thank you. Mr. Cheney.
Good morning. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak. As a quick overview, I know some of the committee members understand what tax forfeited land is, but I thought I'd briefly explain how we get to where we are. All property in the state is subject to ad valorem property tax, except for governmental entities and certain other things. So every December you pay your property tax. If you do not pay your property tax, then come the following August, the land is sold at the courthouse steps. Now, today's technology, it's no longer done at the courthouse steps. All the counties do it by auction online. Most property is purchased by a private entity or an investor. Those properties that are not purchased are, quote, sold to the state. Now, under the current law, you have 2 years to redeem your taxes. And you go to the courthouse, pay the back taxes, pay the fees, pay the assessments. If that is not done on the properties that are sold to the state, they are then certified to the state, which means every year the Public Lands Division, and I have Tyrone Hickman here, who's my division director, we get certificates from each of the counties showing the properties that they didn't pay their taxes on that are now owned by the state. We get approximately 2,300 parcels statewide. And as y'all can imagine, the property that we get, you know, if it's already gone through a tax sale twice, that kind of gives you an indication of the value or the type, because if it's got value, most of the time it's purchased by a private investor. So every August we get this list, we add the property to our inventory, and the purpose of the Secretary of State's office is to immediately work on selling that property to get it back into commerce. So we have a tax forfeited land staff that works on marketing and selling these properties. Last year we sold we get about 2,300 parcels, and we're selling about 2,300 parcels, so we're kind of breaking even. Now, when we sell a parcel, up to 4 years of back taxes goes back to the county to be distributed to the county, the city, the schools, whoever's in that taxing authority, and any additional funds are returned to the state for their general fund. And last year we returned approximately $1,500,000 back to the general fund from the sale of tax forfeited property. So in an overview, we kind of get the dregs of property. We work really, really hard to sell the property and get it back in the income stream. The 50,000 foot view, right now statewide, we have about 7,000 parcels. This is down from approximately 20,000 parcels that we had, after the housing crash 2014, 2015. So we've worked really, really hard to get that number down. more locally, we have approximately 2,100 parcels in Hinds County. Of those 2,100 in Hinds County, approximately 1,900 of them are within the city limits of Jackson. And committee members, we are working on, and we have multiple maps, and as y'all ask for details, we can get details. I have a rough map on the screen behind y'all that shows kind of the general location, starting with downtown, of the tax forfeited lands in the city, within the city limits. Another number, last year we sold property back within the city limits of Jackson. We returned about $150,000 to the city of Jackson from tax forfeited land. Of the 1,900 parcels we have, approximately 250 to 300 have some sort of dwelling on them. Most of our property is vacant. Not saying it looks great, I'm just saying it does not have a dwelling on it. One interesting point as we work through tax forfeited land, as we work through the city, as we try to address this issue, I think it's important to know that while we have 1,900 parcels, we have identified probably about 900 parcels that the city of Jackson has, because the city of Jackson acquires property for some of its housing projects or its public use. Our research shows for about every one piece of property that we have, there's probably 3 to 4 in private ownership that's in a bad state. Now, I'll throw out a term now so you understand. Kind of the new term is VAD, vacant, abandoned, and dilapidated. So if you start talking about dilapidated property, that really doesn't cover everything, because that if it's a dilapidated property, that kind of implies there's a structure on it. But vacant, obviously everybody knows what vacant is, or abandoned, it might be still owned by somebody, but it's out-of-state owner and you can't find them. So that's, when usually if there's a fire or there's an issue in the public, the first call is, oh, that's the state property. We get called saying, go clean up your property. Well, 1/20th of the property might actually be ours. That's, in a nutshell, that's sort of the overview of tax forfeited lands, what we do. I mean, we really work hard to get it off of our rolls. Couple other points. The Secretary of State has no statutory authority nor budgetary authority to clean up any property. If there is a piece of state-owned property that needs to be cleaned up, and I mean, we cannot clean it up because, one, we have no funds, but two, we don't have the authority to clean it up. There is a statute, 29-1-145, that allows the Secretary of State's office to reimburse municipal clerks or chancery clerks, obviously either a city or a county, for cleanup costs. But in 2016, when the legislature swept funds and changed the budgetary process, there is no money in that fund. And there has not been any money in that fund since 2016. So when we get calls about cleaning it up, or a clerk says, well, we reimburse us, we cannot.
Just to interrupt you briefly, is that the fund that we tried to work with last session when we were dealing with the bill that would allow the Secretary of State's office to go in and cut down dead trees?
Yes, ma'am. I believe starting in 2022, maybe 2023, there has been a bill introduced either in the House or the Senate to allow us that 1.5 million that we return every year. There was a bill that was going to allow that to either that amount or a portion of that to go into 29-1-145 so that we could clean up. Now, what we do is we try to be very proactive, and if there is a property that needs to be cleaned up, we usually try to call the city code enforcement in whatever city that might be in, or the county board of supervisors, and we sign what's called a right of entry that says, look, if your road crew happens to be out there and wants to cut the grass, go ahead. Or if you've got some funds and you want to take down a building, feel free. So we're very proactive within what we can work on trying to make sure things get cleaned or can get cleaned up. I believe the other day we signed about 9 letters for various cities to go cut grass in areas. So we recognize the issue. We're trying to come up with ways that we're within our statutory scheme to help address them.
And I think that you have with you a list or a grouping of suggestions of things that we could potentially do legislatively that would help with this. Is that accurate?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you go through those with us?
I would be glad to. And I will point out, just kind of give credence, I noticed the city of Jackson recently is talking about trying to clean 11 commercial properties. I would point out that 2 of those are tax forfeited out of the 11, and we actually are working on a sale of one of them. So that kind of shows the ratio of what's state held versus not. And I do have a map at some point I can provide y'all that shows where the state property is, where the city property is, where Hinds County property is. But addressing this issue, the legislature can give us all the money it wants for us to go out and cut grass and take down buildings or set 29-1-145 up that we can pay as people cut grass. But I really is looking at this problem from how we end up with it. I think the first step is you have to look at the municipality and their code enforcement officers and the people that are on the ground to keep the property in a good state to start with. For example, the city of Jackson, I believe, has 3 code enforcement officers, and I think they're training a couple of new ones for a total of 5. The city of Clinton has, I believe, 6 or 7. So if you ratio that, Jackson should have 20 or so that we could go out and say, look, cut your grass or we're going to fine you, or cut your grass or we're going to start a proceeding toward your property. So you got to start, I am old enough to watch this on TV, Barney Fife, nip it in the bud. But you got to start there. And if you can start there, it doesn't get to the dilapidated state that nobody will buy it at a tax sale. Another issue that we're seeing is in getting these properties cleaned up, the environmental court at the local level is overwhelmed. Now, whether that means an overlay district with additional judges, that's up to this body, but the quicker that code enforcement can get involved and then get an adjudication, that would help. You also have an issue that is a thornier one when you get a property such as, using Jackson as an example because it's been in the news, the Hotel O, or the apartment complex Casa Grande, or Briarwood 1. These properties are privately owned but are in a dilapidated state. But they're having trouble finding the owner, serving the owner. There's a shell game of, it's not this LLC, it's this other LLC. There's been some mention of, health department type quick take or something, but a very narrow group of really detrimental property, can drag on. Casa Grande drug on for years. Briarwood 1 drug on for 3 or 4 years. Hotel O is still dragging on. So, coming up with a mechanism for the real problem children to clean those up. Then, as you're moving up, when you get to the sale process, whether a 2-year redemption should be changed to 1 year is something to consider. Also, under the law, if a private individual pays the taxes on a piece of property at an auction, he pays the taxes the second year. Well, then that third year, when he gets the property, he can say, no, I don't want the deed. Well, you have some situations where you have a piece of property at the first tax sale that, say, is a house that could be lived in. Well, it goes 2 years through the tax sale. The guy that bought it says, no, I can't flip it. I can't make it work. I'm going to let it go. Well, it goes back through the county courthouse steps again. Somebody else buys it. Goes 2 or 3 years. We have some property that was rehabilitatable, but it stayed in the tax sale system 9 years before it came to us. Well, you can imagine what that house looks like after 9 years. So, do you change the law that say, hey, if you buy it for 2 years at a tax sale, you have to have it? That's an area where we see as a problem. And then finally, if we do have it, do we have funds to cut the grass? Do we have funds if there is a building to tear it down? So you can't just say, well, Secretary of State, here's some money, clean up your property, which, don't get me wrong, that would be helpful for 1,900 pieces of property, but it wouldn't address the whole problem. And with Tyrone sitting next to me, I would be remiss to say one of the things that we have done in getting property back on the market is work with churches and other groups locally, because just selling it to an out-of-state individual doesn't necessarily, it gets it back on the tax roll, but it doesn't improve the area. But if you get, say, Rosemont Gardens, Voice of Calvary, New Horizon Ministry, those groups that all of a sudden will get 8 or 9 pieces of property, rehab them, you're changing the neighborhood in addition to just getting tax relief. So I know I end up with it, or we end up with it at the end of the cycle, but really there are ways to tweak it, the whole step process, to improve it.
For the committee members, just briefly, you've got in front of you a sort of diagram, the Monopoly Man diagram that our wonderful Cole prepared for us, that goes through a lot of what was just talked about in a very simplistic way with a little bit of humor to help us all understand it. And I think it's very helpful to look at to understand some of these issues. But one thing I just wanted to ask to make sure that I understand correctly, during that initial 2-year redemption period, as I understand it, the Secretary of State is not allowed to touch the property. Like, you can't clean it up, you can't do anything during that period. Is that correct?
That is correct. And interestingly enough, during that 2-year period, we don't even know we have it because it has not been certified to us. Now, if you were at the county, if you walked into the county courthouse and looked up the property tax records, it probably would say state. But until it is certified to us, we cannot do anything on that property, because if we make any improvements, if we clean it up, we have created a donation issue to the state. The state cannot donate. And if you think about it, well, heck, I can let it go for taxes, let the state come in and spend $200,000 to tear down my dilapidated hotel. I'll walk back in and pay $300 in taxes, and now I've got a new lot. But we cannot, until it is certified to us, we do not have ownership. We have a future interest, but we do not have ownership, so we cannot touch it.
Do you have a recommendation on a way in which to address that so that we aren't dealing with a donation issue, but we also are not letting properties sit for 2 years before we can even attempt to remediate anything?
Well, not speaking for the secretary, since obviously that's more of a question for him, but if you change the redemption period from 2 years to 1 year, and it's been 2 years since, I think, the Constitution of 1890. I mean, this is not some new change that made it 2 years, but that would... There's got to be a balance in, hey, giving somebody that maybe lost their job or having a tough time to come redeem their property versus staying out too long. So maybe 2 years to 1 year, but that one, I think the main thing is not so much the 2 years, but making sure it's only 2 years. It's not 2 years with buyer A, then 2 years with buyer B, then 2 years with buyer C. That more so would be, the continuation of the spiral versus just, what happens in 2 years or 1 year. But I would say maybe making it 1 year, but it's more when he doesn't get the deed and it starts the process over that really kills us, because we can see that if we got it, we could do something with it.
Before I open up for questions for the members, have you gone through all of your presentation? I know I've interrupted you 100 times. I'm sorry.
No, ma'am. I've hit the highlights, and to be honest, it was more of we're here to answer your questions. The main thing is I'm very protective of my staff, and we kind of get beat up with you're not taking care of your property, you're not taking care of your property. But when you realize that probably 1 out of 10 is ours and the other 9 it's not, just as long as everybody knows that just because it's abandoned and dilapidated does not mean we own it.
Questions from members? Gentleman from Rankin.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for being here today. You've answered a lot of questions for some of us already. My question it may not be something that you can answer, but I know that when seniors go to nursing homes on Medicaid, there's an issue with their home. If they own a home, there's an issue with their home being tied up by Medicaid, and it's sitting there and nobody being able to do anything with that home. Are you aware that situation has occurred? Are y'all dealing with that any?
We're not dealing with that because it hasn't come to us. Now the whole Medicaid, the federal law, look back 5 years, the federal law asset we're familiar with it, but it doesn't come to us because it's still, the taxes are being paid, or that they were homestead exempt anyway, so there were no taxes owed. Tyrone here is diligently writing notes, and we're going to look on that, but we're not seeing that. What we do see on occasion more is the elderly individual died, that doesn't make it to the Department of Revenue, and so you could go 10 to 15 years with children or somebody else living in the house, paying rent or renting it out, but not paying ad valorem taxes because they think, oh, it's still Miss Jones who's 88 that's exempt. So we do get some of that, and we do see on occasion we get property from the homestead turnback where it gets caught, and the taxing authority says you owe 9 years of back homestead and people don't pay it, so we get the property that way versus a tax sale. And sometimes through income tax. But the Medicaid issue, I'm aware of, there's nothing that falls our way with it.
Yeah, from what I understand, from what I've seen it personally, that the person's home sits there vacant, and they cannot, the heirs cannot rent it, they can't do anything with it, and it's just sitting there.
Because they don't want to incur income that the Medicaid gets.
Right. Because if any income at all that goes to the original homeowner, then their Medicaid stops and then nobody gets paid. So I think this is and basing this on conversations with a lot of different mayors and different places, that it's a problem all over the place, but it's not something that the state can solve that I'm aware of. But I'm just trying to figure out if y'all can help us determine how big of a problem it is.
I would say we get, about 2 calls a year on that issue, maybe 2? 1 or 2 calls. So out of 7,000, use numbers, if we've got 7,000 properties, but we get a Medicaid type call once or twice a year, they just don't come to us, because that's, like I said.
Okay, thank you so much.
Gentleman from Hines.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. You answered a lot of information for us already. Just one quick question. You talked about 900 properties that belong in the city of Jackson. Do you know how many of those properties need to be, I guess, demoed?
It was 1,900.
Oh, it's 1,900.
We have 1,900. The city of Jackson has approximately 700 to 800.
Okay. So I'm saying, but you know how many of those properties need to be torn down instead of just vacant lots?
Of my 1,900, we believe, based on the Hines County tax roll has a column that says improvement. Of the 1,900, about 250 have a check in that improvement box. So that implies there is something that needs to be demolished. So I would say 250 out of 1,900.
Okay. Do you know there's a cost estimate of how much that'll be total for those 250?
About 4 years ago, when we were working with HUD and Mississippi Home Corp on the blight elimination program, it was estimated to cost around $7,000 to $12,000 to tear down a house. I would note that the media recently published an article talking about the city of Jackson, where they had said that they thought it would cost $7,000 to $8,000 to tear down property. And so that 7 to 10 was the last number that was officially told to us. 7 to 10 is what I read recently is the cost. Now, obviously, commercial buildings are a little different. I know one commercial building that we have, they said it would take $200,000 to tear down. But
Okay.
7 to 10 is the back of the envelope.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman from Hines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And also, Mr. Cheney, thank you for taking the time to come here this morning. And I have a question in regard to the properties. I know the state where the Secretary of State cannot touch them for 2 years. So after they've been certified, after the 2-year period, are y'all able to do anything as far as cleaning them up at that point?
No, sir. We have them on our inventory, but we have no statutory authority or budgetary authority to do any sort of physical cleanup. The only statutory authority is for us to reimburse, but we have no budgetary authority.
And you said prior to 2016, there was some funding to possibly do these things.
Yes, sir.
And did you see it as success when you had the funding to do these things?
Obviously, if a piece of property it stays cleaner and neater, it's easier for us to market for sale. And I'm sure some of the individuals that will speak after me will talk about how having a clean, neat piece of property keeps off bugs, vagrants. You know, if it's just high grass, you have infestation from rodents and other creatures. If it's a dilapidated structure, those are other problems. But obviously, a clean, neat, vacant parcel benefits everybody.
And under this, so the 2-year redemption period, are the municipalities allowed to come in and clean the properties and put a lien on the property?
I don't know that statutory scheme. I do know that it seems to happen on occasion. And whether it's through environmental court, where they get a court order to do it, or the citizen says, I can't do it. I do know there is another municipality in the state that's working through a grant program, and what happens is the homeowner deeds the property over, the city cleans it up. So I know it's done, it's just done either through various grants or scheme sounds shady, but mechanisms. So I know it's done in other places, and how it's case by case, I guess.
And my final question, around 2016-17, I can't remember the exact year, but your department had an agreement that y'all were making with local real estate brokers to sell tax forfeited properties. I think it was like a pilot program. And when that happened, I saw a lot of properties being liquidated and sold. Now, when you're talking about real estate brokers having expertise at selling properties, I think that would make them more marketable versus the process now, because the properties are really not being marketed unless someone goes to your website.
I would argue as to the success of that program, because what you had, and I will compliment my staff of 5 and Tyrone here that work really, really hard, but what you had happen, a lot of brokers just basically lost interest because, we can't negotiate much on price. And that you get somebody that seemed like they were interested and then leave. It was a whole lot of work for a little return. And to be honest, I don't know if we had any brokers when it kind of phased out that were even left that wanted to participate. But we have a very active social marketing campaign. We have our website. And I say we, I've got Tyrone here. Tyrone works with code enforcement officers. They go out and put signs. If you go through the city of Jackson, you'll probably see areas that say, cleaned up using Home Corp grant, this property for sale, tax forfeited. So we do a pretty good job marketing, in my mind, and especially if you look at coming down from 20,000 properties to 7. And for example, the city of Jackson at this height probably had about 6,500 properties. So to cut 6,500 down to 1,900, primarily with internal staff, I'll stack that up.
All right. Thank you so much for all that y'all do.
All right.
Lady.
Thank you, Lady Chairwoman. Thank you all for being here and giving us this information. I have 2 questions. The first one, can you repeat the organizations that you listed that are able to purchase, or is it just churches, or are you allowing neighborhood associations and organizations in regards to having those properties?
Anyone can purchase. Within the city limits of Jackson, obviously there's a need. And so, I know Habitat for Humanity has worked with us some. I use the example of the neighborhood churches just because that's the most recent example. And it also kind of shows that there's neighborhood investment, there's community investment, and that goes a long way as y'all look at laws and how to deal with this issue. Getting the taxes paid arguably is not as big a problem. We sell property all the time to people within the United States, so let's not get to that area, but that might not live here. Okay, well, if I sell it to somebody that in Nevada that buys 4 or 5 as an investment thinking he's going to sell it, or I sell 4 or 5 to the guy that lives 1 street over that's going to come cut it and see what's going on, there's an intrinsic benefit to it being sold locally. The taxes might get paid, which then pays police, fire, and everything, but then if they're having to go respond, it maybe is not a net gain. So we'll sell to anybody, we'll work with anybody. We actually had a private individual that was looking at, maybe some housing as he looked at investment for a business, to bring a business in where his worker's going to live. So we'll work trust me, we will work with anybody within the confines of the law to get it off our inventory.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman from Reagan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Secretary Cheney, you mentioned environmental judges. Could you kind of expand upon that? How many, or who does that fall under?
That is an area that I can get you more information, but that falls under the municipalities.
Okay.
Do you know how many Hines has?
I do not.
I just know that's one of those mechanisms that we know about, but don't have involvement in.
Okay.
I do know that in dealing with, and we have a very good working relationship, as this focuses on the Capitol complex and the capital city, we have a really good working relationship with the City of Jackson code enforcement people who are going out there taking our signs or reporting problems to us. The city can explain that aspect better. I just know that getting personal jurisdiction over somebody is a problem at times, and just the volume of cases, if there are 40,000 tracks that need grass cutting or need to go before a judge, that's a volume.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Gentleman from Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is going to come, or let me defer to my attorney friends. Mr. Cheney recommended we up the time period for redemption of taxes. In other words, if it goes for tax sale in August, you're going to have an investor pay those taxes. Now, we don't want to step on anybody who's still living in a house and falling on hard times, but is there a way that we can do a mechanism to speed up the process, whether it's a certified letter to the owner of the property stating, do you want to keep this property? Because a lot of times it's going to be an investor that has these properties that they're fed up. And me and gentleman to my right, we do a lot of properties down that way. The longer that property sits on there, you're going to have a squatter, you're going to have all of your wiring stolen, you're going to have all of your windows broken out, and this is going to happen within 1 or 2 years. So I would recommend maybe my attorney friends look at a mechanism to speed up the process to where you can contact the owner at that moment and say, hey, do you want to just relinquish this property? Because after 3 years, when it's time to redeem that property, it could just be garbage. It could be burned down, and then you're sitting on the vacant, dilapidated structures at that point.
We've started looking at ways in which we can do that legally without coming into any constitutional issues as far as shortening the time period. Also looking at what we can do with respect to service of process issues. Some of these registered agents are no longer supposedly the registered agent, even though they've never updated their information. Looking at all of those issues, seeing how we can address those legislatively. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I want to be a little careful. These are ideas. Obviously, any recommendation would come from Secretary Watson. These are just things we are seeing. So I do want to point out that I have a boss.
We understand. Thank you. Any other questions before we move to our next speaker? Thank you, Secretary Cheney.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Vernon Hartley. He is a city council member for Ward 5, and he is going to speak to us, at least in part, about a task force that the city of Jackson has started concerning blighted property and their efforts to address this problem from a city standpoint. Thank you for being here, Councilman.
Thank you so much for having us here. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Jackson City Council, our President, Virgie Lindsay of Ward 1. And first of all, thank you, Chair Menzel. Thank you, Chair Yates. Thank you, members of the Capital City Revitalization Select Committee. We certainly appreciate all your efforts in helping us to better our capital city. On behalf of Councilman Ashby Foote, he is the lead on this task force that we're looking at. The three steady players are myself, Councilman Foote, and we also have Ms. Catherine Tate who is our recorder and a constituent representative. And I'll have a few slides, but primarily I'd like to just talk with you this morning. This is a new initiative. Several months ago, the City Council, Jackson City Council, put forth an initiative or a resolution, which basically stated that we will create this task force. And the objective is to ensure that we come up with a plan. We realize that this is a large problem in the capital city, as I will get into in a moment. Not only is it a large problem for the citizens of Jackson, but the state as well, because this is, in fact, our capital city. Let's see. The goal of this task force is, first of all, we don't want to go through that ready, shoot, and then aim method. We'd like to take a step back and examine all the elements that are involved, bring all the necessary stakeholders to the table, and then develop a plan. With that plan, we can go forth and accomplish together, accomplish reducing blight in our capital city. That plan hopefully will help us to articulate the needs to address blight and abandoned properties, or as Secretary Cheney said, VADS, vacant, abandoned, and dilapidated structures. It'll also help us qualify for significant funding that the capital city needs to address the vastness of this problem. With that, we hope to assemble a team of stakeholders. Those stakeholders, and we are already fortunate to have state government involved. We have State Senator John Horn, that we've already sat down with and discussed as a key member of this task force. We also have State Representative Ronnie Crudup, who's also a key member as well. And we've already sat down as well and spoke with Secretary Cheney and Mr. Hickman that spoke previously. We will continue to meet with different stakeholders. Everyone that's involved in this process, we want to meet with them. On a federal level, especially funding sources with HUD, we want to meet with them. We've met with county supervisors, city program managers, and others. But primarily, we want to get anyone that is affected by this issue at the table. In the city of Jackson, we have a number of we have a problem with the abandoned properties, and it has a significant impact to our city. We have overgrown lots. We have houses, structures that have been burned out that are eyesores on our streets and in our communities. And again, this problem is widespread. Some of the more poverty-stricken areas of our city are probably the most impacted. However, it is a city problem. The impact of blighted properties in our capital city, first of all, it affects our property values. Any house that's on the street or houses, and you have these blighted properties there, the property values goes down. A lot of folks have invested their entire lives into their homes and their properties, and then they suffer a loss here. It also affects the neighborhood appearances. We need strong neighborhoods, and it's hard to have those strong neighborhoods when there are vacant lots and burned down structures all along. And I think it was mentioned earlier, we have problems with squatting. homeless individuals or unhoused individuals moving into an entire street in some cases and occupying some of the houses and taking away copper and other things of value. It also presents safety and public health hazards. Personally, when I've gone out and cleaned up some of these abandoned properties, first thing I see is rats fleeing. We also have snakes and other issues. Also crime, and that's not on there, but that's a big issue. Blighted property seems to be a magnet to draw in the criminal element. And also, this is an interest to everyone, it takes away from the positive image of our state capitol. We want to present the best face possible to anyone coming into Mississippi, any outsiders of our state capitol. We want to attract new businesses and new residents to the capital city. And also affecting everyone is the impact to our tax base. Because we can't attract as many business, because we can't attract new residents, that ultimately impacts our tax base, not only for the state taxes, state revenues, but for the county and the city revenues as well. This task force hoped to identify the severity of the problem. We've already had some numbers put out for number of state properties, and that's, I think that number was 1,900. There's also city properties that we need to get a handle on, and that we are. There's private residential properties. There's also commercial and business properties, all of them being in an abandoned state and an unmaintained state brings down our capital city. And this is simply a map. In red indicates the state properties, the state forfeited, state-owned, tax forfeited properties within the city of Jackson. This task force will look at examining ways to get funding sources. The Jackson City Council, right now, we're working through our budget process. Code enforcement is a major priority in our planning for the next fiscal year. We will be increasing funding for personnel and equipment. There are serious deficiencies in personnel. There's deficiencies in also our ability to demolish properties. And it's the task force understanding that the master plan is necessary going forward to even qualify for significant funding that the city needs to address the vastness of this issue. And through a team approach, I believe we can gather a lot more funding to help resolve this. Working together with federal government funding, state funding, nonprofits, and other sources, I believe we can put together a good plan. And working with a good plan, I believe that we can do a lot of good in improving the quality of or the blight picture within the city of Jackson. One other thing, and it may have been mentioned earlier, but we're looking also changes to the law. City council is a legislative function. One of the things we need to do is we need to hold both the residential and commercial properties owners responsible for the upkeep of their properties. Right now, we do have environmental court, and our code enforcement folks are feverishly going through that court, bringing folks before that court. And I would say this, one of the most effective things is to take them to the court, take individuals and businesses to the court, and have them to do the work. That's one of the most effective things. But we will be looking, this task force will be looking to identify laws, policies, and ordinance changes. State laws and policies that could help here, city ordinances, and neighborhood codes. All these things play a part in holding folks accountable for their properties. Crime. We believe that abandoned properties are a symptom of other issues that must be a part of our plan to reinvigorate and revitalize the capital city. We have to get control over our Jackson crime epidemic and improve the public's perception of Jackson as a safe place to live and do business. This is absolutely critical that we examine our abandoned properties and blighted areas. Crime must be attacked and brought under control. For that reason, we have already, in our preliminary meetings to develop this task force and task force members, we've already met with Capitol Police, Sheriff Office representatives, and the City of Jackson Police Department. And we believe that they will be an invaluable player in helping us move forward and establishing good plans. With that, I'd like to just end by saying we believe in it. We need a holistic approach. We need all hands on deck. Everyone here around the table and everywhere is a stakeholder in this. This is our capital city. And we certainly appreciate this Capital City Revitalization Committee for all the efforts, and we look forward to working alongside any state efforts to accomplish relief in the blighted area. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Councilman. It was mentioned earlier that the city has 3 to 5 code enforcement officers at this point. Is that correct?
That's correct. There are more officers, but they're in different areas. One of the things that we are proposing is cross-training in order to improve our numbers, but we need additional personnel.
How many code enforcement officers do you believe, or do the council believe, are necessary for the city to do what it is that the task force believes needs to be done?
Again, we're still developing that plan, but I would anticipate somewhere in the neighborhood of that 15 to 20. Is that a reasonable? Yeah.
And do you have an anticipated timeline on how long it'll take the city to get up to that number?
No, ma'am, I don't.
Okay.
I'm sure, again, this is a priority for the Jackson City Council, so we would try to expedite that process.
And you mentioned environmental court and some of the other mechanisms that the city can use and is using. I wanted to the extent that you can, just discuss one example I think that everybody at the table and probably everybody in the room is familiar with, the Hotel O and sort of that ongoing saga. I know there's lawsuits pending, and so what we can and cannot do is sort of up in the air. But could you just sort of walk us through that process and how it started and where it is and sort of where some of the hiccups are, so that the members of the committee might understand what we might be able to do legislatively to help prevent something like that from happening again?
Okay. Well, I'm not as familiar as my colleague. I believe that's in, perhaps is in Councilman Foote's, it's in another ward. I did have a similar structure in my ward on Bobby Rush Boulevard and Highway 80. We had a hotel there. The issues we had was, first of all, trying to hold someone accountable. Again, it was mentioned that sometimes there's a dance done on ownership, maybe transferred to a relative or someone else. And so the code department and our lawyers have to go through that process of trying to get that person, the person accountable. Then while that process is going on, because if we're going through environmental court, we're going through other elements of the process, while that's going on, I noticed, first of all, several unhoused folks hanging around. Then there were more and more coming to the empty hotel. Then there was trash and tires and other things being dumped around the facility. Then there was a homicide Later, there was another homicide. Then there are other crimes. These are some of the issues with these properties being abandoned. The community suffer. Businesses suffer. And one of the limitations is, you might say, well, can the city put a lien on that owner? Well, one of the things is the limitations of our funds for demolition of properties. We currently have at least 1,000 properties that could be eligible for to be demolished. With that, and I think a number was thrown out before, but it's a total of about $8 million for those 1,000 properties. Again, that's a limitation, and part of this task force is to look for creative ways, outlets that we can pursue to get that kind of money.
So would you say, in a nutshell, that the biggest problem with these hotel properties that we're looking at that are making the news is ownership, finding out who owns these properties, getting proper service on the supposed owner? Is that the biggest or one of the biggest issues?
I believe that is one of the initial biggest issue is holding someone truly accountable, being able to nail them down to, hey, this is your property, is creating all these problems in our community. Therefore, you either clean it up within a certain period of time, there'll be, or justice will be served. And I'm not opposed to jail time.
Gentleman from Hines, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I know a lot of questions keep coming up referring to code enforcement, and I know they're not on the agenda. Would it be okay if some of the code enforcement officers that are here come and answer some of these questions that have been asked?
Yeah, absolutely. I would have loved to have them here today, but the person, is there somebody here today?
Yes, code enforcement is here.
Yeah, please, come to the table. I was told that nobody was
if we can
available from
have,
code enforcement today.
Mr. Brunson and
Come, please.
either Ms. Miller or Ms. Graves.
Yeah,
Ms. Graves, do you want to step up?
Thank you for that.
yeah. Welcome to the hot seat. Lady from Hines.
Thank you. And this is perfect. Maybe you can answer my question, Mr. Brunson. Thank you, Councilman Hartley, for being here, especially since you represent the area that I reside and represent in Jackson. My question is, can you give us a walkthrough of code enforcement's process in general, just with these properties and just your basic process? I'm a citizen. I call code enforcement, the steps for my cop, so we can all know what the process is.
For the record, I'm Robert Brunson, Manager of Code Enforcement for the City of Jackson, and I can give you that information. Normally, we get an intake come in from a citizen, our 311 call, and we are assigning to an officer to go out to investigate to see if what they calling in is actually a violation or a gripe. So after the inspection, officer come back in, they'll send out a letter to the owner, and it's a courtesy letter. We'll want the first letter coming from the city to be, hey, you've been a good citizen, but now we're taking you to court to try to get some jail time. We want to give you courtesy notice to let you know, hey, you get time to correct this. And after so many days, that can be 2 weeks or it can be 30 days, depending on what kind of violation it is. You're not going to have a demo house tore down within 30 days if the owner even wanted to do that. But after that letter come back and no response, we start a court case on it. And that could be environmental court or administrative hearing. The difference between the two, both of them are in the court, but the administrative hearing allows us to use the City of Jackson funds, and the adjudication comes through the City of Jackson council members. Environmental court, the judge rules right there. It's guilty, innocent, tear down, go to jail. It's a more direct court. But after it goes to administrative hearing, now we got to, if it's a demo, I also have to go back out serving notice that it come from the city council would cause a determination letter. It's been determined that this property is a nuisance to public health, safety, and welfare. And when that notice is put out, they have 10 days to appeal that to the city council. And if they don't appeal it, we have to put what we call asbestos samples on it, which our officers do that too. We're probably one of the few in the state that have to do that part of it too. And if that come back negative, positive, then we can put it on what we call a bid pack and contract to bid on it according to if we have funds for that property to be cured. You know, they go through the same process. Mr. Grass and we, all of them go through the same process. And if that process is quickly said, then done. Anytime you send something out to someone, you have to give time to respond. You know, that's just pretty much law. You know, if you write someone the summons, they got a right to appear in court. If they don't appear in court, then the judge can set a fine or penalty like that. But average, I know we talked earlier about, I know we focus on demolition. You tear down every house you want to tear down. We also tear down the economy too. But we got to come to a point, how do a house get that way? What happened to a person, you know, to walk away? What make them walk away from a property? You know, what kind of program we have to help them save themselves in their house? It got to be a holistic thing. We just can't say we're going to be just reactive to this. We got to do some proactive things too. I can probably walk down the street and tell you which house is going to be burned in the next few weeks. And it's not a strategic thing. It's not a rocket science. It's about the foot traffic you see. You see a lot of people walking, and you can clearly see they're not supposed to be in the neighborhood. You see someone pushing a basket, and not to be funny, with a refrigerator and stove on the basket, you know, a grocery basket. You know, they're looking for somewhere to do stuff like that. So we can fund a lot of things, but we also have to, if we're serious about code enforcement, we're going to have more people. We're going to have more funding. And it got to be a holistic thing. We can't just do it by ourselves. We have a great relationship with the Secretary of State office. I mean, a great relationship. And they're been there for us. And most of the faces I see here, we'll talk, a lot of the representatives have met personally. And we have but we got to put it all together. And we've been so separated on this code enforcement thing that if we don't pull it together, we're going to keep getting the results we're getting. Any more questions, man?
Gentleman from Hines, Mr. Bell, did you still have a question?
I do. Mr. Hartley, you mentioned about this task force that you started with the usual suspects. Who else is on this task force?
Well,
who are the other members on the task force? How long has the task force been established?
Well, we've been developing it for the last, probably for the last 40 days, month and a half. Again, right now we're trying to assemble this team. Again, we want to not rush to judgment on a lot of things. We want to get all the players a good understanding of what they bring to the table, and we want to make sure, but to answer your question specifically, the members, we've talked to, again, our state representative and state senator. We've talked to Secretary of State's office. We want them to be important members. We've talked to members of the Hines County, the State Capitol Police, the Jackson Police Department. We've talked to an important member, Ms. Williams, the local HUD representative, and she's going to be a valuable member of this team as well. But again, we want to make sure that we do this right. There's a lot at stake, and public trust is one of the things that's very important.
Correct.
And
so let me ask you this question. Is there any consideration to have other entities, other organizations that actually focus on housing to be a part of this task force? And I'm not talking about the usual folks that you just named, but I'm talking about other entities that also reside in the state of Mississippi.
I think that's a great idea.
Right,
I would like to.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Lady from Hines, Representative Foster.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. I live in the city of Jackson, Western Hills, and I did hear you, Hartley said there are 3 code enforcement officers.
Yes, ma'am.
Who are the other 2?
You mean their names?
Yes.
Okay. Runs?
Thank you. There are actually 2 code enforcement officers than myself. I'm training 2 more now. We have 2 more to hire when we get through interviewing. But that's what we have in code enforcement at this time. You need their names?
I would love to, because I was always just given your name as one code enforcement officer. But I'm hearing there are 3 others, and I have documentation of many calls that I've had called into code enforcement for a property in Western Hills where I live and serve as the homeowner's president. So that's why I was wondering, are there others that we can call other than calling you all the time? Are there others? Because you're all over the city of Jackson, and if there are 2 more, I would love to know who they are.
Yes, and there are, and I would say this, when I started, there was 11 officers, and I was the 12th officer when I started here. And also, I would say that those officers cover from 55 to Clinton line, and one officer.
Who are those other 2?
That's Christopher Collins and Vincent McDonald. And 2 new officers are.
Are they going through training now?
No, there are the code enforcement officers that's been working with me. That's what get the number 3 from. Me and 2 others.
Okay, I hear you all saying you need funding for this, right? You all need funding for this, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and what is the funding going to cover?
Well, hopefully, concerning personnel, we hope to increase the number of code enforcement officers as well as the administrative staff. That's another deficiency. We need more folks in the offices running the records, answering the calls, doing that administrative background as well.
Okay, I know my vice president in my neighborhood called last year in 2023, in April of 2023, about a property on Old Spanish Trail. And I haven't heard anything as serving as the president. And she and I walked the neighborhood late yesterday, and we didn't see anything have changed. And that's why I was wondering, what is the funding for? Is it to expedite those properties to get it done, or what?
Well, again, I hesitate because, again, we're still developing that master plan, but that master plan, I'm sure, will include personnel. It's also going to include an ability to cut grass and make sure that those properties are maintained, in addition to demolishing buildings. So there's going to be, several things that any type of funding will address.
It will help cut the grass.
Yes, ma'am.
Because, Mr. Bronson, you and I just had that conversation last week about 2 properties. So that's why I was wondering, what is the process? And I hear you all say go before the judge and all of this, but what happens when it's almost a year old? That's why I'm wondering, what is the funding for?
And I understand what you're saying. By law, once we adjudicate a property, we go on to correct the violation. We only have one time that year that we can go back onto that property. We can't manicure someone's yard every week, every month.
But this was just one time.
Right, that's right.
This was last year.
Right,
April
but that don't mean when we go on there in April to do something, we're going to have the funding to go back on there in October to do it. So that's what you come in. I know you're talking about 4014 Spanish Trail, 302 Spanish Trail.
And that was reported last year.
Right. And it has been cut before. That's the long property, but we don't have the funding to keep going on.
It's never been cut.
Yes, ma'am. Well,
no, it's never been cut.
Yes, okay, we will argue about that, but if we...
I'm not going to argue about it, but I knew it had been cut because I walk the neighborhood every day.
That's right, and I understand what you're saying, but we won't have the funding to just continue cutting like that, and sometimes we run out of funding. We do a lot of demos, we're not going to have, we get one budget every year, and whatever that we spend out of that budget, we just don't have it to cut it. And also, I would say this, that we have bought equipment, being the code enforcement officer, but the other 2 officers, we go out and we cut yards to try to save the city money. We get on these lawnmowers, these weedies, we cut down bushes, cut down tree limbs, whatever we have to do to resolve some of these issues ourselves. That's not part of our job. That's something we decided to do, to be more proactive in what we're doing. So it's not just writing the property up, and all these properties are state properties, that we get a letter of entry to go on, that we can have consent to go onto the property and cut down, and we're working well with that. And I also have to say that we have a great relationship with the police chief, police staff. I mean, they are great. They're out there, boots on the ground with us, with the illegal dumping. So it's a cohesive thing, but I wish we could just go onto each property, and to resolve some issue, because it's a beautiful neighborhood you stay in. There's 3 properties out there that we have this issue with. Resolve those 3 properties, we keep this neighborhood up. And that's one of my priorities, that neighborhoods that's balanced, we want to keep them there. And those that need to come up, we want to spend more money into those neighborhoods that people can vision. You can't vision putting something there. If this house burned, that house burned, then you got a schoolhouse, kids walking to school, grass this high, snakes coming out into the road. It's hard to vision putting something else there if we got all this blight. So I commend you, because you one of the ones that always called me before you got this position. We want those kind of calls. We want those kind of calls. So I mean, but we never have enough funding doing it like we're doing it now.
I mean, if they
And
get,
one thing I would say
have
about
no problem.
funding, you asked a question about what the funding would go for. We can't keep qualified officers here with the salaries that we pay, period. Most of my officers don't leave because they don't have something better to go to. They leave because they have a better opportunity to go to. Not that they don't love what they're doing, but you cannot raise a family, cannot support kids in school, you cannot buy a home when you're almost on the verge of having to apply for government subsidies yourself in the city of Jackson job. We got to pay. You talk about Clinton. Clinton got 26,000 people that live there. 26,000. That means 171 homes if you count theirs in Clinton. But Clinton code enforcement officers make $3 or $4 more than the code enforcement officers make in Jackson. We talk about Madison. You're talking about $19. So some of the stuff we don't want to talk about is what I have to talk about. I got to fight for my officers. If you want better patrol, you want better quality of people that working for the city of Jackson, you got to pay better wages.
Well, we don't mind paying, we just want them to do what they're supposed to do.
Thank you, Representative, for that. That's a very good question, but here's the issue.
We're going to move on to the next question so we can try and get back on schedule a little bit. All right, gentleman from Rankin.
Yeah, thank you. How much does a code enforcement officer make?
Glad to tell you. Code enforcement job is listed on the city website, go from $12.42 to $15.36 an hour.
Okay. And I wanted to go back to the environmental court. How many judges do you have on that? How often do they meet? And do you need more judges on that panel?
We have one environmental judge, and that's Judge Reynolds, that we have on there. But now we have 2 different environmental court dates. One judge does the trials, that's Judge Reynolds. One judge do the arraignment, that's Judge Henry Clay. So we just worked that out. So it should be a better process now. Because in the past, you go to arraignment, say you're guilty or innocent, and it's 30 days before you actually come back for a trial. But now what we do, we have the arraignment, then 2 weeks later, literally you're in the trial. It shouldn't take no, and let's sped up the process some more. I can't tell you how many judges we would need, because we got enough judges for the officers we have now. You can only write so many cases. One officer can only appear before the judge, for so many hours. So if we get more officers, we probably will need more judges.
Representative from Hines.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate both of you guys for being here. And I just really have one short question. So you said when you started there were about 12 code enforcement officers. When was that?
That was in 2015.
2015, okay. And so that was under a different city administration, I believe, than the current? Okay, so since you've been there since then, first of all, whose primary responsibility is it to sort of recruit and retain code enforcement officers?
that would be the city of Jackson. Again, we, we got our different branches of government. We are the legislative branch. We take care of voting on taxpayers, the expenditure of taxpayers' money. The executive branch, mayor, department head, supervise, direct the actions of code enforcement, their numbers. We have to answer your question, we have a human resources department within the city of Jackson. We present them with a budget of taxpayers' money. They allocate it out depending on department needs.
Okay, so since you've been there, do you see the same level of support in your role as code enforcement officer from the city administration?
Certainly. Can I just interject one thing? Sure. And that is, I worked for the city of Jackson around 2008 to 2012. There were at least 15 code officers running around then. So the number has drastically changed, and not in a good way. We desperately need, and that's where we're getting back to this plan. We want to make sure that we study this entire issue, and then we'll know exactly how many officers, where the money needs to go, and we'll have the full faith of all the stakeholders and the community. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate the effort that's being done by the city council in regards to this issue.
Yes, sir.
Because I know you guys take on a lot of different city issues. I just wanted to understand whose responsibility it really was to make sure that there are more code enforcement officers that are hired. I understand that the salary is an issue that obviously affects your ability as well as the administration's ability, but I do appreciate the city council for establishing this task force.
Yes, right now the city council is going through our budget hearing. We have already heard from code enforcement division. We have made not promises, but we have made it a priority to make sure that we fund additional positions. But looking at it as a holistic approach, getting funding source from federal government, state government, county, us working together to put together packages, I believe we can get sufficient funding that we need for the salaries, for the demolition of houses, and other objectives to reduce blight.
I want to thank you all both for coming today. I just recently met you at the Legislative Day at Livingston Park.
Thank you for attending.
One of the most exciting things that I see happening here today is some of the residents that I met at that event. They're here today in the audience. And I think that's one of the keys to this, is that the resident of Jackson stay involved. It's what got me excited about that event. That's why I wanted to be on this committee. So I want you to support your residents in any way possible. I know we're working a plan today, but we have grass cutting equipment today as well. I think we need to make sure those right-of-ways are cut and do what they want to make their neighborhoods look better. And with that, I think we're going to move on to the next segment of our hearing.
Thank you.
Our next segment is going to be a panel discussion from law enforcement. We have Chief Bo Lucky with Capitol Police, Chief Joseph Wade with Jackson Police Department, and Sheriff Tyree Jones. All three of these gentlemen are going to touch on how blight impacts crime within our capital city and what they need from us legislatively to help make their jobs easier, to help keep us all safer. Thank you, yeah. Thank you all for being here. What I would envision, and you guys can kind of roll with this as you would like, but just if you'd like to each just take turns and address the members and let us know areas that you've seen where blight has been a problem in your enforcement, things that you think need to be done legislatively to help address those issues, code enforcement problems that you see that are problematic that you think need to be addressed or tweaked, whatever it is that you think needs to be addressed whatever blight issues need to be addressed from a crime standpoint that you think we need to hear about.
All right, good morning, everyone. I want to thank the committee for allowing me to be here, allowing us to be here. This is a very important topic. that impacts the quality of life in the city of Jackson every single day. I bring you greetings from the 263 men and women of the Jackson Police Department. But before I get started, I want to commend Robert Bronson and his team for the work that they do. I know the work that they do. They're in the fight every single day. I call him all the time. He's very responsive, so I want to thank him. Dilapidated housing, vacant homes, blighted property is a major issue in the city of Jackson. It's an epidemic, pandemic, however you want to title it. It's a major issue in the city of Jackson. It attracts squatters. We have a major issue. I stay in South Jackson. Squatters all over the place. You can't go down a single street without seeing somebody squatting in a location. These individuals then convert to illegal hookups, water, electricity. It's a major issue. They also attract pests, filth, rats, rodents, possums, major issues that people simply don't want around their family. Also, prostitution. These abandoned properties are being occupied and being used for prostitution. And our kids walking to the bus stop have to see that type of chaos and foolishness all the time in the city of Jackson. I had the opportunity to visit Key Elementary and met with the principal before school started. Her biggest concern was the library that was abandoned next door to the school. It had been boarded up, squatters had taken over, and she was concerned that the kids had to return to school and see people out there naked laying around this building, right? We contacted Public Works, we had a conversation about it, and they got the building boarded up. But that's a major issue that we have to deal with every single day. Again, drug activity, drug use, drug sales. It checks all the boxes in the city of Jackson. It's a haven for vandalism. It's the broken window theory. If you don't care about your property, why should I? Vandalism, windows being broken out. And this is the issue that we see when you talk about these dilapidated properties, abandoned properties. We have individuals, like I stated, the broken window theory, who come to our city and dump their filth and trash at these dilapidated homes. You may see 100 tires underneath a garage at a dilapidated home, because if we don't care about it, why should they? We have made a concerted effort at the Jackson Police Department with our neighborhood enhancement team. They are arresting individuals for doing this. Most of these individuals don't stay in Jackson. They're coming from other states, and they're even coming from our bedroom communities that are neighboring us into our city, dumping their trash and going back to their communities. So we're taking a very proactive approach to that. The homeless individuals, the squatters who come into our neighborhoods and occupy these homes, when it gets cold, like Robert Bronson stated, now you can wait, because it's just a matter of time before that structure is burned. It's going to burn, and it's also going to damage the good citizen's home that is next door to that property. I've seen people where this dilapidated home was burned by a squatter or homeless person. Now the whole side of their home is black from the damage from that home. So, again, it's a major issue. All those burning fires of these dilapidated structures are straining our fire services here in the city of Jackson. It's straining our fire services. The gentleman talked about 1,900 structures in the city of Jackson that belong to the state. We're having to respond to those 1,900 structures because of these homeless individuals, squatters, and individuals who have a propensity for crime here in the city of Jackson. We have found individuals inside these structures who are deceased, whether it's natural causes or victim of homicide, or have overdose on drugs inside that home. The scent, the smell in that community is horrible, it's horrendous. But the most important thing, and I hear this from South Jackson to Northeast Jackson to West to downtown Jackson, this is impacting their property value. You have all these beautiful homes on certain streets in Jackson, but then you got these 2 or 3 that are vacant, dilapidated, and it is destroying that wonderful neighborhood and impacting the quality of life for those citizens who live in that community. Our citizens deserve the same resources. They deserve the same funding as other people here in the state of Mississippi. When they were under the police department, they had 15 code enforcement officers. I'm not asking for them back, but they had 15 code enforcement officers. But he was right. We fought for vehicles for them under the leadership of Chief Lee Vance at the time. They got new vehicles. The uniform he's wearing is because they were underneath the police department. We got them uniform. They had to look the part. We recruited people to be a part of the code enforcement team. It's very, very important what they do, but 3 people, 1,900 dilapidated properties and all these other issues that they're dealing with, that's a Band-Aid approach. You're putting a Band-Aid on something that's of pandemic proportions. Again, I'm open for any questions. I'm very passionate about this because I see it every single day. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Sheriff?
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Representative Yates, Representative Mansell, other House members, the legislative body, the concerned citizens and residents of Hinds County and the surrounding municipalities. I believe that this conversation that we are having today is what I would consider an investment in our city, our capital city, our county, and the state of Mississippi. 2 things that you have to address. You have to address public safety, and you have to address infrastructure in the communities. The Hinds County Sheriff's Office is willing to work collectively with all stakeholders to be able to address the issues that we are facing today in our communities. And I would just kind of elaborate more on what Chief Wade spoke about specifically in the city of Jackson, because of course, you know, when it comes to Hinds County, we serve throughout the county, but the major priority or issue that we're discussing today does occur in the city of Jackson, unfortunately. But with these blighted properties that we have to respond to, and we have to address issues of vagrants, drug sales, drug use, homelessness, and another thing we have to always consider when we talk about the social issues, the individuals that may be occupying these residents or these blighted properties also suffer from some type of mental illness sometimes. So there we are having to address social issues along with the blighted properties. The appearance of these properties, once again, have caused property values to go down. It's just not attractive and it's not welcoming for people that visit the city of Jackson and Hinds County also. Another thing that's very important that I've also noticed is the owners of these properties, and I think the gentleman spoke about it earlier, live in other states. It's my understanding that they may live in other countries also. They are not prioritizing the process of making sure that these properties are taken care of and that they do not have the appearance that they're having. I live in Northeast Jackson, and I'm familiar with the Northeast Jackson property now that has come under a radar. And we believe that this particular property belongs to someone in another country. And it's my understanding that the occupants of this residence have illegally hooked up lights, water, and other utilities. But not only that, you have to address the scammers that's involved with this as well, where you have people that are posing as realtors. Remember, I said this house belongs to someone else in another country, but scammers are posing as local realtors, and they're actually renting these properties out to individuals that are occupying these properties. And that should be a concern that has to be addressed, and these people need to be identified and they need to be held accountable and dealt with throughout the judicial process. But outside of that, I think that all three of us can probably attest to the fact that we deal with these blighted properties, and we need all resources we can to be able to address the blighted properties and hold people accountable. As far as the county is concerned, we may not have the authority that code enforcement have to enforce some of this, but we want to work alongside everybody to make sure that it is enforced and it is addressed. Another thing, and I've had people to approach me about this before, about the use of inmate labor to clean some of these blighted properties and to clean them, cut the grass, or do whatever it is. The blighted properties that are owned by the state. As you all know, the Hinds County Sheriff's Office do not have state inmates in our facilities. Out of the 900 detainees that we are responsible for on a day-to-day basis, these are what we would consider pretrial detainees. But I'm very open to a discussion of having state inmates, whether it is a small group of them, to be able to have a work crew to address some of these blighted properties and some of the issues that we're facing with the state-owned properties throughout Hinds County. And we provide security and we provide transportation for these state inmates to go out and work at some of these properties to help clean this up. So again, that would be my take with this. I believe that we are in the presence of the right individuals as far as the state legislative body, that we can have that discussion of that being a possible solution to some of the help that we can get to help clean up some of these state-owned properties, whereas I've heard the other gentlemen speak about the millions of dollars that it costs to maintain these properties. So again, thank you all for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you all this morning, and I'm also open to whatever questions you all may have of me also.
Good morning, and thank you all for allowing me to be here today. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members. Thank you, everyone else. Really, there's not much more I could add to this topic that hasn't already been talked about. You know, each jurisdiction here in Hinds County faces the same issues. The things that Chief and Sheriff are mentioning, we're also seeing in the CCID. I would add that my most recent experience was at 2 o'clock this morning when we got a call from Pearl Police Department needing assistance to locate an individual that was being held inside of a abandoned structure here in Jackson. We were able to go into that structure, clear that structure, and retrieve the individual out and get them to safety and get them to a shelter elsewhere. So it's a real problem that we face every day, like Chief Wade says, real problem we see every day. And literally 2 o'clock this morning, we were pulling someone out of a shelter or out of a structure, abandoned structure here in downtown Jackson. You know, that's going to be an ongoing investigation, and we're not real sure where that's going to lead as of yet, but there's a lot of criminal issues going on with these abandoned properties. A lot of the issues that we see, drug use, you know, prostitution, a lot of these individuals in here, they are on drugs and they are very erratic. They can be dangerous. They can be very violent. And in downtown Jackson, when you have these structures with these individuals in them, and you have, you know, you and I walking on the streets, walking to Chick-fil-A, walking, you know, just walking, nice day outside, walking around the Capitol, you know, that's very unnerving. That's something that we don't want to deal with. And, you know, we feel your pain on that, and we can certainly sympathize with you on that. We see the issues. I would like to stress that, you know, we do what we can in law enforcement, but there's a lot of times that our hands are tied. There's a lot of constitutional violations that come into play when you talk about dealing with vagrants that nature. And, we wish we had the solution. We wish we had the answer to all this. The most common answer here is more resources, more manpower. Certainly Chief hit on this, and I believe Sheriff did too. We're responding to calls at these addresses. On top of the 18,000 calls that we may get in a month for calls for service, we're also responding to additional calls with these individuals in these houses, squatters. Another thing we're seeing is not necessarily the tax forfeited properties or the abandoned properties, but properties that are being rented, rental properties that belong to people out of state, out of country, who they don't check on their properties. And it might be 2 months before they realize somebody's moved out. Well, at that time, I believe you mentioned earlier, the copper's been stolen out of the house, the windows are shattered, air conditioning units missing. It's become more of a liability than an asset. And, with the property values around here at this time, you really want to sink $5,000, $6,000 into a $10,000 property to fix it up. A lot of times they just leave it the way it is. We've had issues with squatters who actually are trying to use force against the actual landowners. Landowners who are trying to send in contractors to fix up the property, and squatters are using force to keep them off the property. And, the crazy thing that we have seen in a couple scenarios is that, again, our hands are tied a lot of times. There's a lot of opinions out there and a lot of judgments out there and decisions that say that there's not a lot we can do with that. And I don't agree with that, but, it is what it is. So, we will continue on a law enforcement standpoint of trying to maintain a vigilant oversight on these properties. I know in the CCID and throughout the city of Jackson, we do try to maintain a more saturated effort in those areas, especially when we're receiving a lot of complaints. But as Chief Wade said, 1,900 properties, that's pretty spread out. I'm not seeing it as much as they are within the CCID. I believe our numbers are much lower than, I believe we're somewhere in the 200 range, and those are very few and far in between. We also have been, and Madam Chair, you already know about this, but we also have been in talks with Fondren, and I believe Ms. Garrison's here today. I believe I saw her walk in, yes. Fondren community and Belhaven communities are also trying to get together with law enforcement, working together in a partnership. And I think that those types of things are definitely something that is needed and deserve a lot of attention. And I would invite that we do this throughout the city, getting better partnerships throughout the city with the community. And it's not just something that let's go out. Hello? All right. It's not just something that we have to look at fixing or the state has to look at fixing, but it has to be something that the community has to be a part of as well. And not just fixing the problem, but also making us more aware of what's going on. There's a lot of issues, as you mentioned earlier, callers, I know sometimes it may seem like frustration, but we need those phone calls. We need to know what's going on. We need to know what's happening. We need to field those calls. We need to be able to know exactly what the community needs. These task forces, these agreements that we're coming up with, these partnerships is just that. That's what it's for. But we can also bounce ideas off each other, community, law enforcement, government officials, and try to figure out more efficient ways to address the issues in a more holistic manner as well. But again, thank y'all for allowing me to be here today, and I'm open to any questions, and hopefully I can provide some sort of answers.
Thank all of you. I think each one of you mentioned your hands being tied, having problems with respect to homeless population or squatters. And from a legislative standpoint, and specifically this committee, I anticipate that we will take a deep dive and have a separate hearing on that issue in and of itself. But just to briefly touch on that, I wanted to ask each of you, just very briefly, to make sure that the committee members here and that I'm understanding correctly, the law with respect to what the police are allowed to do versus not allowed to do with respect to arresting a homeless person or removing a squatter, dictate what the police can and cannot do. That is correct, right? And oftentimes what you guys can and cannot do is not necessarily what the caller would like to be done. And so there is some frustration there in what the community would like to have done, and what you guys are able to do because of what the law says can or cannot be done. And so I think that we need to look at legislatively what we are allowing our officers to do or not do. And again, we're going to have a separate hearing on that at some point later this year, just to look at what those laws are and how we can address that. But are there other issues around that same vein in anticipation of that hearing that you think that we need to look at, where you guys feel like you're hamstringed?
Who's first? All right. Well, it's a major issue. First of all, as we talk about these squatters, the Jackson Police Department, we're not in the eviction business. We don't evict people. And the same thing applies to these squatters who moved into these residences and set up that is their domicile. That's where they live. And we have a neighbor that is calling us about this person being a squatter. And like the sheriff stated, their property is more than likely either owned by the state or somebody who lives in Detroit or Florida. So the most that we can do at that particular time is run them for warrant checks to see if they're wanted by law enforcement, or we do what I've employed is a field contact form. We take a picture of that person, we get their information, and it's amazing that you find that most of them are not from Jackson. They're not even from the state of Mississippi. And some of these individuals are gang affiliated. Some of them have recently been released from prison. And that's their new home, this home that they found vacant on your street in South Jackson or West Jackson or wherever part of Jackson that they're at or that they're located. But we have seen an increasing population of homeless people invade the city of Jackson. It used to be just North Jackson, from Lakeland Drive to County Line Road. Now you see them on Highway 18, you see them on Cooper Road, you see them on McDowell Road, and they're not from Jackson, Mississippi. So I think legislation needs to be visited in reference to the rights that squatters have as they move into these neighborhoods and take over these properties, and also as it relates to panhandling in the city of Jackson and across the state of Mississippi. You know, we had an enforcement effort several years ago about panhandling. You can't pull up to a red light in Jackson without somebody knocking on your window. You know, but it's not just Jackson. I was in New Orleans about a month ago, and I think I had the cleanest windshield in New Orleans, because every intersection I went to, somebody cleaning my windshield and knocking on my window. But we were told that if we arrest them, that we can be sued for violating their constitutional rights, and that was by the ACLU. Now, we understand that they're out in the flow of traffic, they're obstructing traffic, that's one thing, but they're on every corner. And you have individuals, like the sheriff stated, that are suffering from mental illness. We've got to address this issue holistically. The mental health component, the substance abuse component, and also just the public health issues. A lot of these individuals are suffering from diseases that are spreading, and we talked about Hotel O earlier. I visited that location myself. I walked inside that structure myself. You see needles, you see filth, and it smells like disease inside that location. So it's a public health issue, as well as my police officers go inside these properties all across the city of Jackson. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. I think we've all alluded to the fact that these properties are owned by people in another state, sometimes another country. So when you find occupants within these residences, they know what the law is also. They're not dumb to what the law is and what the law says, especially when it comes to trespassing. If you don't have someone to sign a criminal affidavit against these individuals because you cannot contact a homeowner or somebody that's responsible for their property, then our hands are tied because there are no criminal charges that can be filed at that point for trespassing. Another thing that we talked about, and Chief just mentioned, homelessness and vagrancy. All things that appear to be vagrancy and all things that appear to be homelessness are not always that particular case. It's a money enterprise that's involved as well. Some of these people that appear to be vagrants, some of these people that appear to be homeless, now that's a select few of them, but some of them get up in the morning from their residences and they come to Jackson from surrounding areas, and this is their trade for the day, is to get money on street corners and those types of things as well. Because like he said, they know that lawfully they may not can be held accountable. And when they finish, they go back to their residences and they sleep and they get up and do the same thing the very next day. So these are issues that we wish that the laws are something there that we could enforce stricter on these individuals, whether it's Capitol Police, Jackson PD, or the Hinds County Sheriff's Office, to hold these individuals somewhat criminally accountable for these things, and it would cut down on some of the appearances that we see throughout the area when it comes to homelessness and vagrancy.
I think we have some member questions. Gentleman from Rankin, I think you waved at me first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm glad to hear that you want to do something on another hearing on the squatting, because I've got a quick question for you. I have rental properties in South Jackson. Currently, I have most of them up for sale. Sent yard guys over there twice, and I've had people in it. Currently, what can you do, or what can I do to get them out? Do I have to file trespassing charges, or can I just call y'all to remove them?
And that's the issue that we're facing. Yes, you can sign a trespassing affidavit on those individuals and they'll be arrested once a warrant is issued for their arrest, but they would have to be legally evicted from your property. Your property, they got to get evicted from it because they set up as a residence, and that's a process that they go through Hinds County, the Hinds County Courthouse.
Okay, that was my understanding. And since we're probably going to have another hearing on Florida just recently passed HB 621, which gives law enforcement the ability, as a homeowner, if I call you and say, there's somebody in my property, I need you to get them out, it gives y'all the ability to remove them at that point without using the court system. Is that something y'all be opposed to or for?
I would be absolutely for it because, as I stated, I'm just continuously talking about South Jackson because you see it so much in South Jackson. Right now, we're a dog barking with no teeth as we deal with these squatters.
Okay, good. It also recognizes, there's another spot in there to where if you pose as a real estate agent to try to list or lease one of these properties, it is a Class 1 felony. So that's something I'm looking at. I've already had counsel looking into it, so maybe we can have some relief on that part of it. Other question, you mentioned that you're not allowed to use inmates to clean up properties. Is that something statutorily we need to fix, or is that a board of supervisors situation, or is it something you want us to be able to help you with in that aspect?
So I'm in support of having it. I have pretrial detainees. I don't have state inmates in our facility anymore. So state inmates can be used for that type of labor, not pretrial detainees.
Gotcha.
Outside of an official work program. Like at one point, we had state inmates that were coming into Hinds County and cleaning up trash along the highways. We were going to state facilities and picking them up and bringing them into Hinds County. So we can get some type of program like that for state inmates to help with clean up some of the state-owned blighted properties. I'm in full support of it, and we would assume the responsibility of facilitating that within Hinds County with the state inmates, but we will have to use state inmates for that.
Okay, thank you. Thank y'all for coming in.
Gentleman from Hinds, Representative Bell.
Thank you. I'm going to try to use my deep voice like y'all been doing today. Seriously, I appreciate each and every one of you. All of you are my friends. I really appreciate you. Sheriff Jones, you mentioned about homeless individuals residing in other bedroom communities coming to Jackson and panhandling. are we still seeing the same issues that we saw years ago where we had individuals from other counties drop homeless people off in the city of Jackson because they didn't want to deal with them?
I think Chief Wade may be able to talk about this.
Let me think about it. Yes. 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 And I have met with some of the chiefs in the metro area, and we've had some honest, deep dive conversations about that. And we've talked about how we could navigate this without that happening. I know that it has happened. It has happened recently, and it's something that we're having conversations about. But we are seeing where people are being released from prison and given a one-way ticket to Jackson.
Right.
All right? Now, we had a gentleman who was breaking into Walgreens in Meadowbrook. He'd go in there shopping every night when they closed, and he's from Detroit, Michigan. How did you get here, right? So we see that all the time. Most of the people that we come in contact with that are homeless, that are squatters, do not come from Jackson. They're not native of Jackson, but now they're here. They're our issue, and they're our problem.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chief Lucky.
Another issue, bringing that issue from other counties, is the mental health issue. You've got the hospitals that are certified to deal with mental health issues here in Jackson. When somebody comes here after, mental health crisis, whether they threaten to commit suicide or they've been sent over here for evaluation for other reasons, they're not being held for 72 hours anymore at UMC or St. Dominic's, for example. They have a limited bed space. So what happens then is they walk out the hospital doors and they're on the streets of Jackson. Well, a lot of times substance abuse, mental illness runs hand in hand.
Right.
So when these individuals are away from family in Hinds County, not where they live, and they walk out of a hospital and they have these types of substance abuse issues to self-medicate for this mental health issue, the streets of Jackson is a perfect place to be for them. That's where they want to be. And that's where, the problem with the blighted properties and the abandoned properties comes in, to where it's not hard to find. It's not hard to link up with another individual walking the streets at 10 o'clock at night or even 10 o'clock in the morning in Jackson, who's doing the same thing, looking for the same thing. So the issues are much bigger than just the properties themselves. The issues, like I said earlier, we need a more holistic approach, and we've got to look at the mental health issues as well, other social issues, not just property issues. I know that the topic today is properties, but we also have to find a way to approach a discussion about the mental health crisis going on and the substance abuse crisis going on. And a lot of times those run hand in hand and lead to the vagrancy and homelessness, squatting, all the things we're talking about today. So we have to find a way to get to the core of what's causing these fumes that we're talking about. The crime is, the criminal activity, the criminal element is fumes of a deeper core issue. We got to find ways to get to that issue and have a more holistic approach.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Chair, I want to commend you both for putting this together and commend the Speaker of the House for putting this committee together. I think that we all know we all have opinions about what the problems are, but in order to get to the solution, it takes all of us working together. And I appreciate you chiefs and sheriff being here today, and all of our law enforcement who put their lives on the line every day. You guys are our heroes, and we thank you for what you do. And we want you to know that we want to be a partner with you to solve these problems, and not always talk about problems, but let's talk about solutions. And I think that's what we're doing now, and I'm glad, because ultimately, when we think about problems, usually there's an us and a them. And what I think we need to understand is there is no them. It's all us. It's all our problem. And we want to help be part of the solution. One of the interesting things that I heard today was that in 2015, Mr. Brunson, I believe you said that there were 20 officers involved in code enforcement, and from 2015 until now to 2024, we've gone from 20 officers down to 3, with 2 more being trained. And my question would be, if the money existed for 20 officers in 2015, where is that money now? Why do we only have three code enforcement officers? And is it just a priority of the administration, or I know it was moved from being under the police department somewhere else, I guess under the executive branch, but is the money was the money moved to another priority, or why did we go from 20 down to 3?
Yeah, I can't speak for the administration, but I do understand his plight and what he's experiencing. That would be a conversation for the administration, for them to answer. But I do know that they understand the seriousness of this. As we talk, as I meet with the mayor, we talk about these properties and the impact that it's having on our communities. I had opportunity to visit 2 beautiful neighborhoods down in South Jackson, Brookwood and Mayfair, and beautiful homes, but always there's going to be that blighted property somewhere in that neighborhood destroying that beautiful neighborhood. But they do amazing work. And another thing and Mr. Brunson was a part of it too, when they were under the police department, we tore down 100 homes during a 1-year period, tore down 100 homes because it was a priority of Chief Vance at the time. It was a priority of the community, and we found the resources. We work with HUB, we work with other agencies to get this done because it was so important. I would like to see us get back to that as a priority, but I think that's probably a conversation for the mayor and the administration.
I'll just say I agree with you, and if there's a way the legislature can be part of the solution, I'd like to be part of that as well. So thank you.
Lady from Amit.
Run for me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've been sitting here listening to the presentations, I had some questions similar to the gentleman from Rankin, Representative Yancey. And I think during Councilman Hartley's presentation, Madam Chair, he mentioned, most cities now are doing their budget hearings. I think he said that they're in the midst of having their budget hearings. I'm not sure if they've adopted their budget, but my request is more for information on how much the city actually appropriates after they adopt their budget. How much are they actually appropriating for the code enforcement? I think during the councilman's presentation, he also said that they were considering increasing that, so I would request that you and the chair be provided that information after the city's budget is adopted. And just for context, if we could see maybe the line item appropriation for the last 4 years to be able to see the increase, decrease that the city makes for that appropriation. And then my second request is that you and the chair be provided the master plan. There was a lot of discussion about the master plan, and I think it would be helpful as we are looking for solutions to see what the master plan actually is as we go into the next session.
I don't think it exists yet.
Well, once it exists, and I'm not sure when it'll be finalized, but hopefully if we're talking about solutions and doing something in 2025, hopefully it'll be finalized.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to our next panel. I want to again thank all 3 of you for being here and for what each of you do every day with each of your departments. We appreciate you guys more than you know, I promise. Thank you. All right, our next panel is going to be Christopher Pike, who is the Executive Director of Jackson Redevelopment Authority, John Harrison York, who is the Commissioner of Jackson Redevelopment Authority, and Taylor Nicholas, who's the President of Great City Mississippi Foundation. These gentlemen are going to talk to us about some potential solutions to some of the problems that we've heard about today. Whenever y'all are ready, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for allowing us to be here, members of the committee. I am Christopher Pike. I'm the new Executive Director of the Jackson Redevelopment Authority. Have been in that role, in that position since February of this year, so very new to the city of Jackson. I hail from Atlanta, Georgia, and so you probably ask yourself, why would you leave Atlanta, Georgia, come to Jackson, Mississippi? But it was really something that I was passionate about. I love Jackson already. It feels like home. I spent 20 years in Albany, Georgia, which is very, very similar to Jackson as far as an ecosystem. And so I'm glad to be here. I want to talk a little bit about Jackson Redevelopment Authority and our role and what we do every day to fight slum and blight in the city of Jackson. We are, in essence, a creature of the state, created under the Urban Renewal Law. That law really gives JRA a lot of latitude to address a lot of the issues that have been discussed here today. It's one thing to demolish a property. That doesn't resolve all of the issues. You got to come back then and have an investment plan on how do you get new development that follows that. And that's really the role that JRA plays. Since I've been here, we've been working on a lot of initiatives to really help speed up a lot of the work that JRA has been doing, and making sure that we're doing the work that JRA was created. And so I'm going to not get in the weeds at this point of the presentation about what the programs that we're working on, but only to say that we are positioned to help take things to the next level as we come up with solutions to help address slum and blight. And so the urban renewal plans that we come up with, for example, working on a transit-oriented development plan for Union Station, which is going to envision a lot of investment within a quarter-mile radius around Union Station. A lot of that is addressing some of the slum and blight issues that you see in the area. And I will say, JRA, when it comes to the unhoused and the mental health issue, we do deal with that a lot. I know that question was asked to the police chiefs and the sheriff. But JRA manages Union Station, and so a lot of those times when people are brought to Jackson, they're brought to Union Station, and then it becomes our issue to figure out what to do with it, what they do with folks once they come. And so we spend a lot of time dealing with security concerns and issues as well. So just wanted to make that point that it's not just the police that's dealing with the unhoused and mental health issues. It's also organizations like JRA that has facilities that people are being brought to, and then we have to figure out what to do when they get there. And so I'm going to end there on my introduction. I'll talk some more about JRA, but I wanted to give everybody else an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we can get into some meat and potatoes, if you will.
Michael. Thanks, Christopher. Taylor Nicholas. I'm with Great City Mississippi Foundation. I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. Representative Yates, Representative Mansell, members of the committee. And I think we all in this room appreciate also Speaker White for forming this committee and you spending your time and your work on focusing on making our capital city a better place. We believe that a stronger capital city means a stronger capital state. In fact, so our 501c3 was founded under a simple motto, which is a great city for a great state. The state of Mississippi has a lot of positive momentum right now. I think a lot of good things happening for it. But, I think we're only going to reach our potential as a state with a strong capital city. We often ask a couple of simple questions, right? What characteristics constitute a great city? And how can we work together with community leaders throughout the city in order to tackle problems and initiatives that can really move the needle generationally, right? And as we look across the board, the issue of blight, vacant, abandoned, dilapidated property certainly fits that mold. So as the committee looks into this, I think we want to focus on solutions today. How can we best tackle these challenges? I look forward to that conversation.
Good morning, and thank you for having us. I'm John Harrison York. I am one of the volunteer commissioners for the Jackson Redevelopment Authority. I joined almost 2 years ago, but I'm from Jackson, grew up here, left for 11 years. I went to college and lived in New York for 7 years. Sorry about that. and moved back about 4 years ago. JRA has really been doing a lot of fantastic work ever since Christopher joined, and so we are excited to share further updates on that as the years go on and we see projects come to fruition. I'm going to kind of get into some of the points we wanted to make, which is really kind of things about how to combat blight. So, like, what are we going to do? And so I think the main point is to have a strategy and not treat it as a shotgun approach where, you're tearing down one house here, maybe one here, just kind of willy-nilly. And so kind of the points that we've come up with for you to consider, for all of us to consider, for the master plan to consider, is one approach would be immediate crime relief. So the group of gentlemen who were just up here kind of looking at state-owned properties, which ones are the biggest source consistently of phone calls, prostitution, all the other issues they talk through. Can we target those properties? And they kind of sit down with the map and spec out which ones we need to target. The second point, or other consideration for a strategy, would be promoting redevelopment for properties that will need the least subsidy in order to redevelopment. Jackson is a very, very distressed real estate market, as we all know. And so if you're going to tear something down and build something on it, truthfully, new construction is probably going to need some meaningful subsidy. And so looking at those areas, though, that may have property values already established or maybe adjacent to those areas that may not need as much subsidy coming in, and overlaying that with state-owned properties. Then the third would be kind of targeting those state-owned properties that are adjacent to key community institutions. So thinking about Jackson State, thinking about Tougaloo, thinking about our public parks. So just throwing that out there, I think the main thing is to have a strategy and not treat it as, we're just going to do this one property, in this ward or this district and this one. How do we have a comprehensive strategy that's purposeful, that's trying to drive change across the city? I don't know if y'all wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think I'd just add, thanks, John Harrison, but pretty much summarized a lot of our key points. We think it's, at least as a foundation, we'd encourage an approach that looks at strategic analysis, a data-driven approach. I think it's appealing on topics like this to try to move as quickly as possible. But I think there's a danger in that with regard to this particular topic of blight, where you can do cleanup and then that same property with lack of maintenance can fall into disrepair and be a repetitive cycle where it doesn't actually have the intended consequences that you all or we all would hope for. So that looks like prioritizing areas of focus, right? What are those priorities going to be? It looks like categorizing sites and properties by condition and characteristics. So we've looked at other, I guess, and a third point, and I'll circle back, is what are best practices from other communities in other states, and what are they doing, and how they had success, right? So we've looked at some other markets in other states, and they've had success in categorizing properties by condition, right? Is it usable? Is it not usable? What are the actual conditions within it? Is it suffering from rot? Is it fire and arson related situation? You can categorize it by ownership, by economic impact, right? Is it on a key economic corridor? Is it on a key thoroughfare? Is it on a corner of a street? Because as we've all heard, and from previous panelists, this issue can be like a disease, right, where it impacts entire neighborhoods and entire, economic conditions throughout the entire city. Another area I would encourage you to look at is youth impact, right? So where are these properties related to playgrounds, schools? What are the activities in these neighborhoods, and what are children able to do? I think all these things need to go under a category-related bucket. We'd encourage looking at using a mixed bucket of funding tools, right? So we believe it's important when you're sketching out solutions to major challenges, what are federal opportunities out there as well as state? What are local opportunities? And we think, solutions, they're going to be far-reaching and generational, are going to include a mixed bucket of nonprofit and for-profit support. And then I would say, I just kind of end on this point for these comments. engaging and utilizing community partners, right? So there are partners like JRA who are already in the neighborhood doing this work. I'll mention Revitalize Mississippi, who's been out there for years, actually in the trenches, knocking down some of these properties and trying to clean up neighborhoods. So I would encourage that as well as being part of the solutions as we continue to kind of talk about this.
And just a few points from JRA's perspective, some projects that we're currently working on. One of the things that we recognize is, like Revitalize Mississippi and other organizations, there's folks that are demolishing homes, dilapidated structures, and that obviously, as I mentioned earlier, part of the solution. One of the things that we're looking at from a JRA perspective is doing home ownership programs. And so currently we own right at 11 lots, residential lots. We have 3 in Presidential Hill, and we have several off of TV Road. And what we're putting together a program that we're working with Hope to secure funding to build the houses and to turn around and have them finance the home ownership and sell that home to an individual. And we're going to use properties that we currently own to kind of get the system, if you will, all the kinks worked out, and then we want to replicate that throughout the city. And so as we look at when we demolish a home, a structure, how do we get it back into a taxable state? We got to have a program and a mechanism to be able to do that. And so we're currently working through that process now. We actually had a meeting 2 weeks ago with Hope to start that process and developing that plan to take before the board for them to approve. But those are things that we're trying to be intentional, and those are the type of programs that we would need funding to help grow and be more impactful. The other thing that I think is important that needs to be discussed is a conversion program. And so we have a lot of commercial properties, which we haven't talked a ton about, but commercial properties contribute just as much to just the slum and blight that we're seeing. And so we need to figure out, if we're going to be a realist, there's always going to be demand for office, but it's not going to be like it was before the pandemic. And so we have to figure out, how do we convert some of these vacant office buildings into residential? The problem is that the numbers don't work from an economic standpoint. If you go and get an investor and say, hey, we're going to give you this building, they're still going to need a lot of subsidies to make that work, and it's going to be more than just a tax break. And so if we can create some type of conversion loan fund that we can then subsidize a lot of these conversion programs that can be in targeted areas. Like, for example, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-something school facilities that just came offline that the school system's trying to figure out what to do with those properties. So if we could incentivize conversion of those to residential or other uses, then that would go a long way to keeping buildings from becoming slum and blight in the first place, but also ones that are already at that level. And then the other thing I will talk about is just a traditional targeted revolving loan fund to entice specific investments in specific areas that we've already mentioned, that we need to identify the areas that have the biggest results or the biggest return on investment, and then figure out how to incentivize. I will say, if we're going to be real about the discussion, there are a lot of challenges to getting people to come and do big investments in the city and in Mississippi as a whole, but in Jackson, Mississippi. And so we have to be more thoughtful and creative in how we incentivize and entice those developers to come here.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman from Hines, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Chris, you mentioned that you're trying to do housing with respect in the city of Jackson. Excuse my voice. Isn't the main purpose of JRA to deal with city properties?
No, actually, under the urban renewal law that's created by the legislature, we have wide jurisdiction to do pretty much any municipal function, and including housing and residential. And so it is in the purview of the law in which JRA was created to do residential.
And I'm glad you clarified that for me, because you and I met earlier during the session about a project in South Jackson.
Yes, sir.
The old Jackson Promenade. Where are we on that?
So we're still working with them for a plan with that, and so that's still in the works. We had some preliminary conversations. We haven't had many conversations since then, but.
So, I mean, it's been since the session is over with, right? So,
Right, yeah, we met with them after this. So after you put us in contact with them, we met.
Yeah, so I think we need to speed that up because we're talking about revitalizing the city of Jackson, and that's a critical key part of the city of Jackson and South Jackson, which I don't represent.
Right.
I will say that I don't represent that area, but those individuals are putting together a plan to revitalize that area.
Sure.
And your entity is a part of revitalizing the city of Jackson. Am I correct?
That is correct. Yes.
All right, thank you.
Any other member questions? All right, thank you, gentlemen.
All right, thank you.
All right. Our last speaker for today is going to be Meredith Massey. She's the Deputy Director of Historic Preservation with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. She is going to give us an overview of what some tax credit situations look like, and I think just a wealth of other information. Honestly, I'm interested to hear some of this because I don't know it myself. So welcome and thank you.
Yeah, thank y'all for having us. I think we're probably the one that doesn't necessarily make the most sense to everyone in terms of being invited to speak today, but we really appreciate y'all having us. And I think we were initially brought into the conversation just to kind of give you some backstory to explain how historic properties and blight elimination kind of work together, because there are various laws at the federal, state, and local levels that specifically kind of have certain reviews and authorities in place to make reviews to approve demolitions of historic properties. And I do want to introduce I have Barry White with me as well. He is the Division Director for the Historic Preservation Division at Archives and History. I'm the Deputy Director. He also serves as our Deputy SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Officer. And so we kind of, even though we're housed within the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, we are the State Historic Preservation Office for Mississippi. And so what that means is we're involved in all kinds of preservation programming. There are federal programs that we administer, but we also administer state programs as well. At the federal level, we review essentially any undertaking that involves federal permitting, licensing, or funding, and we ensure that that project won't necessarily have an adverse effect on historic properties. At the state level, we also administer the state preservation law, which is the Antiquities Law of Mississippi. So anything that is publicly owned or a designated Mississippi landmark requires a permit and review from our office to ensure that that historic property is not adversely affected. And then we also provide technical assistance at the local level, specifically communities that have made preservation a priority in their planning. And so the City of Jackson does have a preservation commission in place and have passed multiple ordinances for various districts in the community to make sure that those districts are retaining their integrity and ensuring that any kind of development or alterations that might be made to specific properties within that district are not adversely affected by inappropriate changes or alterations that might compromise their integrity. We have a lot of questions that are thrown at us regularly because we are involved with so many different programs, and there's never really a straight answer with historic preservation. It always kind of is, it depends, and a lot of that depends on the funding source as well as the ownership, and we really do look at projects ultimately on a case-by-case basis. And it really just depends on, again, the ownership and the funding source before we can make a determination or advise someone how to move forward with a specific project. There are a few specific points after talking with some folks that y'all wanted us to kind of touch on and explain in a little bit more detail, so I'm going to go through those. But if y'all have any questions as I'm going through, or if something doesn't make sense, obviously, please feel free to jump in. But one big thing that came up during some conversations was kind of architectural survey, what it means for something to be historic, and where Jackson is in terms of designating historic districts at the national level. And so architectural survey and the National Register of Historic Places is kind of a term that's used interchangeably with historic districts, so I'll kind of explain the difference between those two very briefly. But they do go hand in hand. You can't really have a National Register district nomination prepared before you have the architectural survey information that you need to determine whether or not there's a viable district in place. And so our architectural history section within our division, they're actively involved with that whole process. They are the ones that review a nomination, review survey information, make that determination of eligibility, as we would call it, if something is historic. And that's not just because of the age of the building. There's a lot of different things that kind of go into determining whether or not something would be a viable National Register district. And they are the ones that work with architectural consultants typically on this type of nomination process and survey, because it is a really technical kind of way to look at buildings. We're not just looking at whether or not, obviously the Capitol is very, very historic, very significant, but we look at other things like social history, government, community planning. There's a lot of different criteria that we look at in determining whether or not something would be historic. And so our architectural historians within our section and within our division are very well versed in that. And because it's so technical, there is often a requirement to have some sort of architectural history consultant involved in those projects, because they do go building by building, do physical descriptions, take photographs, site plans. If there's any kind of history that they can find about a previous owner, if it's a residence or something like that, all that's included in the survey form before it comes to our office. And then those architectural historians in-house will review that, make sure that all the information is on track, and that the references are all kind of lining up with the language that we would use in-house. And then from there, if there is an interest from that architectural survey producing a nomination for a district, that's a separate process that also is handled by our architectural history section. And what that does is it really kind of sets the infrastructure and groundwork at the local level to understand what your resources are, and really catalogs that and gives you an inventory, so you really know what kind of buildings you're managing, what the histories are, if they're contributing or non-contributing, which is a term that we throw around a lot with districts, because just because your house is within a boundary doesn't necessarily mean that it's a historic building. That does often happen if something has burned down or been demolished over the years. There might be a newer construction within a historic district, and that would be an example of something that wouldn't necessarily be contributing to that historic district. There was another question I think that came up about who is involved with getting something listed in the National Register. As I mentioned, the City of Jackson is a certified local government. They have passed a historic preservation ordinance and do have an active historic preservation commission. But the city doesn't necessarily have to be directly involved in funding or actually, moving forward with the process and getting the ball rolling to designate a historic district. That can come from private sources as well, or neighborhood associations. We see that a lot. There are some grants through the CLG program, provided that the City of Jackson is in compliance, because the CLG program is a regulatory program. But to offset the cost for architectural survey, because it can be a little bit expensive considering the kind of work that you're doing, the comprehensive look at the buildings that you're having to produce in terms of the deliverables for a survey. And so that is something that, we're able to kind of review on a case-by-case basis and see if there's funding available to help offset the cost on that. But there's other funding sources available in addition to private sources. For example, go ahead. No,
can you touch on, for the committee members, what it means to be part of one of these districts, and especially with respect to blight, how being part of one of these districts would be helpful in potentially eliminating blight? And then as a second question or follow-up to that, I think I know that there are some areas within Jackson that are sort of ripe to be one of these districts, assuming that the funding can be there to make this happen. Talk about some of those and how we could make that happen potentially, and what that would look like with respect to eliminating blight in those areas.
Sure. So historic districts, again, it's a term that's thrown around loosely. There's National Register historic districts, and there are locally designated historic districts. A National Register historic district does not put any restrictions on a property owner in terms of what you can and cannot do with the building. The local designation does. And that's something that would have to go through the commission to review if you wanted to demolish a building. However, the value in having something listed in the National Register is that there are some tax incentives available to restore historic properties if something is listed in the National Register, which is a huge value. I think that you can be eligible for up to 45% back at the federal and state level. The state also has a 25% credit. And again, it's just having the architectural survey information is great in terms of a planning tool for the city to understand the resources, know what's historic, and know what potential incentives could be there to help fix up a property to eliminate some of the blight in those areas. However, we do often deal with federal blight elimination programs often in our offices as well. And I know that was something that Councilman Hartley brought up in terms of wanting to speak with HUD and talks with them about their blight elimination programming. We deal with that type of programming through HUD actually across the state and other communities. And a lot of times what we see is if a community, say, applies for a HUD blight elimination grant, they decide that these are the target areas specifically that they are wanting to deal with and remove these certain houses. From there, we will get that list because, again, we have to review federal undertakings to see if, what properties are going to be demolished, what that scope of work looks like, and if any of those would either be eligible for or potentially are already listed. And what we do is we meet internally and with the municipality and come up with that list. Essentially, the path that we typically will take, depending on the number of resources that might be demolished, is to come up with some sort of memorandum of agreement. And we'll have the full list of what resources they're looking to eliminate and come up with a mitigation strategy to help offset the loss of those resources in a way that might be valuable to the municipality as well. But of course, we would like to look at resources that, an area that maybe has a similar history of the same time period, get that survey information, and then that's kind of not necessarily a negotiation, but it's a way that we can kind of resolve that adverse effect to those historic resources by coming up with a product and a deliverable that's useful and might get another area potentially listed in the National Register, so those property owners could potentially, take advantage of the tax credits. Does that make sense?
Yes, and just so I understand it, if you have a neighborhood, say, that it ends up being listed and becomes one of these designated areas, the homeowners within that designated area that qualify to have their individual homes listed as a, you used two terms earlier, participating, non-participating?
Contributing or non-contributing?
Contributing, non-contributing, okay. So if you have a contributing home, then you could use the tax credits to renovate your property, update your property, whatever the case may be, correct?
Yes, if it's contributing or if it's individually listed.
Okay, and then if within that district, there are blighted properties that need to be cleaned, demolished, whatever the case may be, are there tax incentives or tax credits that can be used for those non-contributing properties that are within that district as well, or no?
Through our office, no. Okay. That's not to say that doesn't exist elsewhere. It's just not with the programming that we administer and work with regularly.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Right. Are there questions from any other members? Lady from Hines.
Good morning. Thank you for being here with us. Are there any applications that you are aware of in the city of Jackson for any historic preservation sites?
In terms of doing some sort of district survey or nomination?
Nomination. Because aren't applications in the deadline for applications coming up is it October?
For the certified local government grants?
Yes.
The intent to apply for next year funding is going to be the beginning of November, and essentially that means it's kind of the first part of the application process. Mm-hmm. We will accept as many notices or intents to apply as y'all want to throw at us, and just based on our funding that we get through the CLG grant program, which is federal, we try to spread the love as much as we can across the state because we have 57 communities that compete for that. Mm-hmm. But we'll give some feedback after the intent is due before the actual application is due in February, and that just gives us time to kind of work with the community, solidify some boundaries for a specific area and make sure it's a viable potential district before the applications are due. And that will also give us a sense of resource count and potentially how much that survey and National Register might cost. And then the applications are due at the end of February and are typically awarded at our Board of Trustees meeting in April. So that project, say it were to be awarded, would not necessarily be in place until summer of next year.
Okay, so within the demographics from the beginning of the map that the Secretary of State placed for us to look, within where you saw those demographics, you maybe can't just tell me right off.
Sure.
Are there any applications within those areas where the highest number of blights are within the city of Jackson?
Off the top of my head, I can't say definitively, like, if there's a specific area that is next on the city's list as a priority. I know that we've been working closely with Rebecca Garrison on a residential potential district for Fondren, but that's something that they're doing separately, not through the city of Jackson, and something that they're just exploring right now. We do have a list that, well, it's a kind of working map that I brought with me. I have about 10 copies that I can pass down of areas that through either Section 106 reviews or just from folks that live in Jackson and know the history can have a sense of the resources in those areas and can show you essentially how many identified either viable districts or potential survey areas exist in the city of Jackson. And this is just survey areas. This has none of the actual listed National Register districts, just to show you kind of how many unsurveyed and unevaluated areas there actually are in the city of Jackson. And we do think and are pretty confident that a lot of these would be eligible for listing in the National Register, and then after that district nomination would be prepared and passed, would be eligible for those credits and incentives.
Lady from Hines.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I have a question in regards to identifying properties that can become a part of the historic record. Are there specific or common roadblocks that some of these properties or areas run into that would prevent them from going on that list?
Sure. So the biggest thing that we run into, I think most frequently, and Barry can maybe speak to this as well, is we'll get a call and come look at an area. The threshold that we use to consider something historic is 50 years of age. So anything 74 and on could be potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. But it's not just the age of the building. A lot of times what we run into is we see substantial alterations or changes to things that are character defining features as we would define them, like replacement windows or putting new vinyl siding over the original clapboard siding, something like that, or an inappropriate addition that maybe protrudes from the front of a building that wouldn't have been there historically. And that's kind of the criteria that we use to determine eligibility. It has a lot to do with the integrity, original integrity of a resource or a building for us to evaluate whether or not it would be listed. And so I think that's probably the biggest kind of thing that we run into is, again, there's a number of resources within Belhaven Heights that maybe aren't contributing either because of their age or because a lot of substantial alterations were made to them at a later date that kind of disqualify them from that designation.
And who identifies that eligibility?
Our architectural historians typically, but again, we also really encourage folks to work with qualified architectural history consultants to do that legwork and survey, because it is a very specialized kind of technical expertise that you have to make those evaluations. And ultimately, all of this criteria lives under the National Park Service, so all of the guidelines that we follow are really set by them, which they're our formal federal partner as well.
Okay, so as you are aware, we are working extremely hard to identify a portion of Lynch Street on the campus of Jackson State University as historic so that we can pull down those tax credits and funds. But there have been some issues that we've run into with the Mississippi Department on some of those buildings because of perhaps some tiles have been changed. So at what length do you go to prevent those buildings from, because I mean the reality is that these buildings are historic.
Sure.
But there have over the years, particularly 40, 50, 60 years, where some renovation has been done just to try to keep the integrity of the building intact, but doesn't necessarily
Diminish the history.
Diminish the history, correct.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll let Barry speak to that because he's actually been closely involved with that.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Barry White. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation. So, yes, we've worked closely with Jackson State and their initiatives. Of course, we're looking at historic integrity and significance. Those are the two parts related to the National Register program. The significance, of course, can be obviously its close association with civil rights, architecture, social history, those sort of things, and the integrity deals with the actual, essentially, architecture of the building. So the Park Service has a set of guidelines and standards that we follow that, specifically for rehabilitation, we understand that these buildings are older. We want them to retain that integrity, but also understanding that they have an adaptive reuse. And so we want people to be able to use these buildings in a contemporary fashion. So we work to, with project professionals going back and forth and figuring out what's the best approach to have a successful rehabilitation.
Thank you. I would really advocate that, and I appreciate your working with Jackson State to help make this project happen. If there are additional standards that are being placed on top of national criteria, that perhaps that be looked at so that we can be successful in this project. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Absolutely. And I would say too, I think that, often the perspective that people have of archives and history is from a regulatory aspect, which is a bit of reactivity, but, I'd like to also emphasize the proactivity and using preservation as a planning tool. For instance, the Pearl, which the ribbon cutting was yesterday, is a fantastic example of public-private partnerships. And tax incentives played a huge role in that, along with many other housing credits and that sort of thing. And it's the bundling of these resources that really make these projects feasible. So we would like to work with you all as well to identify these properties that would be good opportunities for tax credit projects.
One last question. We've heard a lot today from speakers in regards to demoing not be the first answer to some of the blight. That there are opportunities to designate some of these buildings and properties as historic. And so, in the event that you cannot receive that designation, what is the alternative if you don't want to demo that property because you can't? Can you legally do anything to the property if it's, not in a situation where it can be designated as historic?
Well, as Meredith alluded to, the answer is always it depends, but I guess understanding, I think what you said is, in preservation, the first thing we want to do is identify the historic resources, evaluate them, and then make a plan for preservation. So the survey is the first part of that. We go out, take a look, and say what makes a viable district, and what is important. Is it for the purposes of tax credits? Is it the purpose of this, that, and the other as we can help. So again, that'd be our recommendation, and then we can work with you to say, this portion of this neighborhood is still very viable. However, we understand if a structure's burned out, of course, it's likely lost all of its historic integrity, and therefore there's not much that we can recommend for grants or et cetera.
Thank you.
Any other member questions? All right, thank you both so much for being here today. We may have follow-up questions at some later point, but we'll get with you separately if that's okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you members for being here. I anticipate that we'll have at least 2 more hearings on other issues before we go back into session, but we'll send out emails, text messages about those as they come up. Thank you.